The city of Sanford, Florida, population 54,000, has never seen anything like the George Zimmerman trial in terms of the international attention, the unrelenting media coverage. And so in anticipation of a verdict and the outpouring of emotion and interest in this case, the entire Sanford, Florida Police Department has been on standby for over 6 weeks. Since before the trial even began, the police chief suspended all vacations and suspended all furloughs. Police officers were given special training to prepare for when a verdict was announced. A special command center was set up in case things got out of control. But that is not what happened. Saturday night, when the court announced that a jury had found Mr. Zimmerman not guilty of second-degree murder or manslaughter in the death of Trayvon Martin, instead, the city of Sanford looked like this. Outside the courthouse, there was a strong reaction, to be sure, but the gathering was just as assuredly peaceful, vocal, but peaceful. Same goes for yesterday, the day after the verdict was announced. There were multiple protests in Sanford, Florida, including a rally in front of the courthouse where the trial took place and a noonday prayer at churches across the city. On Saturday night, on the other side of the country, protesters took to the streets in San Francisco and in Oakland. There were some reports of vandalism in Oakland. One person was arrested, but by and large, the protests were peaceful. Then yesterday was a big day for organized protests all over the country.
If he wouldn't have followed Trayvon, we wouldn't be here today.
They also say this is about more than the death of Trayvon Martin.
We see senseless death each and every day in the city of St. Louis.
Those participants throwing Skittles up in the air. The gesture meant to send a message mainly to federal prosecutors. Protesters are hoping that gatherings like this will keep pressure on the Justice Department.
Hundreds of people took to the streets of Atlanta tonight to protest the not guilty verdict in the George Zimmerman trial.
More than a dozen people took to the streets in Dallas to protest this verdict. They were holding signs saying no justice, no peace.
It's about more than guilt or innocence at this gathering, but what the case again exposes, a deep racial divide alive and well in America.
So there were more than 24 organized protests around the country, including in Los Angeles, where people gathered in front of the CNN building in Hollywood. Police officers in riot gear were called in to disperse the crowd there, and about a half dozen people were arrested. Some protesters blocked a major freeway for about 25 minutes in Los Angeles. In New York City, protesters gathered during the day at Union Square and then again in the evening in Times Square. About a dozen people were arrested overall. In Newark, New Jersey, hundreds of people braved 95-degree heat to wave signs high above their heads and chant "No justice, no peace." They marched to the federal courthouse. This is outside the Justice Department. A few people with a lit sign, "Justice for Trayvon." In Chicago, hundreds of people gathered for a moment of silence before the verdict. There was a fairly concerted effort, I should say, to terrify the country about what kind of horrible reaction there would be to the verdict. There was a verdict, indeed, this weekend, and people responded with demonstrations. And they were almost entirely peaceful, emotional protests all around the country. Last year, after young Trayvon Martin was killed, but before charges were filed against George Zimmerman, there were massive, massive protests in Sanford, Florida. Across the country, people were shocked and scandalized by the teenager's death, but Sanford was the epicenter. And sometimes when big protests like that happen, especially big repeated protests like that happen, the Justice Department, they dispatch a special unit called the Community Relations Service to go meet with law enforcement and involve parties and help monitor protests to try to make sure everyone on both sides behaves peacefully. That happened around the protests connected with the Trayvon Martin, George Zimmerman case. And last week, the conservative organization Judicial Watch decided that that itself was a scandal, that the protests were not real, that the protests had been drummed up in a conspiracy by the Obama administration. Look, documents obtained by Judicial Watch detail role of Justice Department in organizing Trayvon Martin protests. Also, this one, DOJ sends secret, quote, peacekeepers where Trayvon Martin was killed. See, the protests weren't real. People weren't actually upset. It was all organized by President Obama for something. This new conspiracy theory has been a big deal in some dank corners of the internet and in some dank corners of TV. You'll never guess where on TV.
The Department of Justice is now responding after a government watchdog group obtained documents that they claim show that an arm of the DOJ was involved in helping to organize anti-George Zimmerman protests last year.
By their own admission, they went down to organize protests, and the protests were for the prosecution of Mr. Zimmerman in support of Mr. Martin, and that's fine. Had the Department of Justice going down there in a very the supposedly secretive organization. They would show up at these meetings with DOJ jackets and hats on, looking more like stormtroopers than facilitators and peacekeepers. They were promoting the protest against Zimmerman. This is a promotion of a protest. It's not being neutral. It's promoting one side of a controversy and in a racially charged way. As Department of Justice employees go down there, they're helping organize marches. The documents that we have, or the press reports, show that supporters of the Martin family were clear in that they perceived justice to be there for them.
So says Fox News World on that subject. In the real world, the Department of Justice sent officials to meet with protesters and city officials and law enforcement to try to keep all the protests peaceful. And if they were supposed to be there in secret, then they probably wouldn't have worn the T-shirts that said DOJ on them when they went to all these public meetings. So, yes, the protests about the verdict have been basically peaceful and emotional demonstrations. Yes, the Justice Department helped plan to keep protests peaceful. And yes, Fox News is going to be outraged about all of that all the time, even if in this case its outrage would logically seem to be sort of self-canceling, right?